In this lecture, we will continue our discussion on cardiovascular system. Part 1, we will recap what we learned about heart anatomy and physiology and discuss some high-yield material. We talked about how there were 4 chambers in the heart: the right atrium, right ventricle, and the left ventricle. This is a coordinated pump that will help the flow of blood in one direction. We will discuss further on how it is important to know how a particular blood cells travel through the body and through the heart. We also talked about how we had a pulmonary circuit and a systemic circuit, and this is closed. In other words, blood will travel in this one direction through the heart. That will take the blood to the lungs, oxygenate them, bring them to the heart, and then the oxygenated blood will then be sent throughout the body, and deoxygenated blood will be brought to the heart. So this is where we will talk a little bit about blood flow through the heart and how a blood cell will travel or do an entire cycle through this closed circuit. This is important even for exam 3. Before we get to that, oxygen poor blood, deoxygenated blood, will return to the right atrium, will come to the right atrium through the superior and inferior vena cava, and also the coronary sinus. If you can remember, coronary sinus is the one that brings all the coronary arteries back after supplying blood to the heart. It will be brought back to the right atrium. So 3 veins come into the right atrium: superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus. Oxygen-rich blood, oxygenated blood, will flow back to the left atrium, and from the left atrium, it will go to the left ventricle, and then from there, it will be sent to the rest of the body. And it comes to the left ventricle, sorry, left atrium, via the pulmonary veins. So what is the function of the aorta? Function of the aorta is to send oxygenated blood throughout the body in the systemic circuit. Function of the pulmonary artery is to send deoxygenated blood back into both of the lungs. So let's imagine there was a blood cell that's going to be in the lung. So it came to the lung, and in the lung, it dropped off any carbon dioxide it had. It collected oxygen from the lungs. Now, what's going to happen to this blood cell, and how is it going to perform the rest of its function? So once in the lung, now this blood cell will get into the pulmonary vein. So shown here in red because this is oxygenated blood. It will get into the pulmonary vein, and the pulmonary vein will come to the left atrium. From the left atrium, it will go through the mitral valve to get to the left ventricle. And in the left ventricle, now it will go through the aortic valve into the aorta and will go throughout the body. It will go, say, for example, to a certain organ, and in that organ, it will give out the oxygen, collect the carbon dioxide, and now join through the venous system. It will come into the inferior vena cava, and from the inferior vena cava, it will come to the right atrium. From the right atrium, it will go through the tricuspid valve to the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, it will now go through the pulmonary valve and into the pulmonary artery, which will now take it back into the lungs. So that completes the cycle. Students are expected to know this cycle and be able to map it out, showing how a blood cell will travel through these 2 closed circuits. So let's do it one more time, just for clarity. So if there is a certain blood cell that's in a particular organ, it dropped off the oxygen, it picked up carbon dioxide, now it will go to the venous system, come to the vena cava, it could be the inferior or it could be the superior if it comes from the head, neck region. So it comes to the vena cavas, and that will go to the right atrium. From there, through the tricuspid valve, it gets to the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, it goes through the pulmonary valve to the pulmonary artery. From the pulmonary artery, it gets to the lung, where it drops off the carbon dioxide, picks up oxygen, and goes to the pulmonary vein. And the pulmonary vein will come to the left atrium. From the left atrium, it will go through the mitral or the bicuspid valve to the left ventricle, and from the left ventricle, it will go through the aortic valve into the aorta and then go to the rest of the body, where it will come back to that particular organ to deliver the oxygen. So please write this out, map it out, because this is an important concept to know. We also discussed the heart valves, even when we were talking about the traveling of the heart through the body. We discussed the mitral, bicuspid. It has two cusps. Tricuspid, it has three leaflets, three cusps, making it the tricuspid valve. And then you have the aortic valve at the base of the aorta, pulmonary valve at the base of the pulmonary artery. Now let's talk a little bit about the cardiac cycle. We talked about how it's a rhythmic contraction of the heart. First, the atria contract together, then the ventricles contract together. So when the atria contract, the atrioventricular valves open and blood travels from the atria into the ventricles, both right and left. At this point, the aortic valve here, and also the pulmonary valve here are closed, so that blood is not going to flow back into the ventricles through these arteries and veins. And then we have the semilunar valve, or the when the ventricles contract. When the ventricles contract, the tricuspid and the bicuspid valves are closed, so blood cannot go back into the atria. And then the semilunar valves are opened, allowing blood flow into the pulmonary artery from the right ventricle and into the aorta from the left ventricle. So please be able to identify which valves open and close during what part of the cycle. We also talked about the blood supply to the heart. It is important to know some of these main blood vessels. We have the left coronary artery, then that gives out the circumflex artery, the anterior interventricular artery that goes along the septum, and we have the posterior interventricular artery on the posterior side, and we also have a right coronary artery. All of these come together through these veins that will form this common coronary sinus that will then bring the blood back into the right atrium. So when the heart is contracting rhythmically, we have two nodes that make sure that this electrical conduction through the heart goes in a proper regulated manner unidirectionally. Main controller is the SA node, sinoatrial node, and when that starts to generate a signal, that will go through both the atria and it will come to this AV node. Once all the signal comes there, now a signal will be generated that will go through the septum that divides the two ventricles. It's called the Purkinje fibers also through the interventricular septum, and that will go across the ventricles, making both ventricles to contract together. Also know what type of waves, what we see on an ECG. We discussed the P wave. P wave is when the depolarization of the atria or the contraction of the atria happens. When the atria contract, you get the P wave. Now when the ventricles contract, you get the QRS complex. And when the ventricles are repolarizing or relaxing, you also get this T wave. So those are the three main waves and complexes students will need to know. Finally, we also talked about how, since this is a closed circuit, The arterial circulation brings blood at the capillary level. It will distribute it to the organs, and then it comes back together to form veins back into the heart. So know this arrangement: arteries go to arterioles, go to capillaries, capillaries join together to form venules, that will form veins and back into the heart. So we will pick up from this point in part 2, where we look at the vascular system, arteries and veins.